When I was in 4th standard, my school teacher did an interesting experiment. She asked us to write a letter to our future selves 10 years from now. Where would I want to be? Who would I want to be? I wrote that letter and completely forgot about it. 10 years later, I happened to find it again. In that letter, my younger self had written about making an impact, changing the world. Reading it was like a wake-up call. I was at a very decisive point in my life. I was about to become an engineer like the rest of my family. Instead, I enrolled into a media school which felt more like my calling and started looking for ways to make a meaningful impact. So in my first semester of college, I did a simple Google search. What is the biggest problem in the world today? That's when climate change popped up. Now, I was very surprised to see this because while all of these global experts, scientists were talking about how climate change is one of the most pressing issues in front of us today, nobody around me was really talking about it. So I started reading more about it. I read that the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere had almost doubled over the last century. The Earth's average temperature had risen by 1 degree Celsius and it was continuing to rise. Extreme weather events were happening more frequently and more intensely. Climate change was leading to sea level rise, coastal erosion, loss of glaciers, changes in monsoon patterns, loss of biodiversity, and a host of other things. Most importantly, I got to know that it was a problem with a ticking clock. We only had 3 decades to avoid the worst effects of climate change. Now, having heard all of this, I had a moment of honesty with myself and I thought, it does seem worrying, but I don't really care enough about it. I was 18, mind you. I had enough on my plate. I didn't really have the time to worry about polar ice melting in some other corner of the world. Climate change seemed like this larger than life problem beyond my control. I was hearing all of these big words, but I couldn't really see how it was affecting me or anybody near me. And so I couldn't bring myself to care about climate change. So I went on a quest to find a cause that could matter to me, a cause that I could care about. First, I volunteered for an NGO that worked in education, to make a film about children and what their dreams look like. Over there, I met a 12-year-old boy, an extremely bright young boy who lived in a slum not very far from my home. I asked him a simple question. If you could get one wish, you can ask for anything in the world, what would it be? I would never forget his answer. He said, I would wish that my house wouldn't get flooded like it did last year. A 12-year-old boy gets one wish, and this is what he has to ask for. I realize that as coastal communities erode, as more and more houses tremble due to catastrophic rains and floods, there will be more and more young boys like him who have to worry about something as basic as a shelter above their head. This I cared about. After that, I spent some time with a remote community of waste workers at the outskirts of Bangalore. Over there, I had the privilege of meeting one of the strongest, most inspiring women I have ever come across. She was a refugee from a neighboring place. She was around the same age as me, but she was already married and she had a young daughter. That morning, I walked with her to the nearest school, where she asked if they could enroll her daughter into the class. But they wouldn't, because she didn't have the necessary documents and she didn't know the language, Kannada. But this young woman, she didn't give up. For the next 2 months, every single day, she walked to the school, she sat at the doorstep and she demanded that her daughter be enrolled into class. Finally, the school saw a way around the technicalities, around the language barriers, and her daughter got a place in the classroom. It was only then that I was reminded she was not alone. I was reminded of the millions of other climate refugees like her, 13 million people every year and counting, who get displaced from countries around the world because of droughts, sea level rise and weather extremities. People like this brave young girl who have to flee and rebuild their lives from scratch in an unknown place, often with children in hand. This I cared about. Then I spent some months with a farming group in Maharashtra. Over there, I met many small dwelling farmers with less than 1 acre lands. One of them was an old man. He said to me, "I just can't afford to keep farming anymore. Sometimes it rains too much, sometimes it doesn't rain on time, sometimes it's too hot, the weather had just gotten too unreliable." I read about the impact of climate change on the Indian monsoon. But this old man, who didn't even know what climate change was, taught me more about it than any global expert ever could. He said, "When I can't afford to grow food, there are 100 people behind me who can't afford to buy food. Climate change means more and more people go hungry." This I cared about. A few years ago, another event struck near my own home. That night, it rained like I had never seen before. I sat scared even under the safety of my roof. Unbeknownst to me, the water body near my house had flooded. Many people lost their homes that night. The next morning, I went for a walk to see the aftermath, and I saw a dead cattle lying on top of a car. Next to them, I saw an old couple of vegetable vendors trying to retrieve their only source of income, their vegetable cart, which was now destroyed in the flood. It was then that I realized climate change impacts our income. It impacts our livelihoods. And for millions of people, it impacts their ability to fend for their families. This I cared about. But could any of this ever happen to me or my family? That seemed like a distant impossibility. Then the floods in Chipadun struck. I got news that a friend's home was being destroyed in the flood. Her 75-year-old grandmother had climbed on top of their roof, jumped onto the boat of rescuers, and fled for her life. Her grandmother looked not very different from my own. Her home looked not very different from my own. I stand before you today. I'm not an expert. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a world leader. But I speak to you today as an ordinary girl. Yes, I don't care about climate change because as ordinary citizens, we care about very simple things. We care about our homes. We care about our food. We care about our health. And climate change impacts our homes. It impacts our food. It impacts our health. It impacts our livelihoods. And most importantly, it impacts our families and the people around us. The missing piece in the fight against climate change is that it's not about climate change at all. It's about the irreversible, irrevocable, and catastrophic ways in which it's changing our lives. And this is just the beginning. We find ourselves at the cusp of some of the most defining decades of human existence. How we act today will not only determine our future, but the future of generations to come. That's not only a responsibility, but it's an opportunity to make a great impact. If you look at some of the biggest transformations in the history of humankind, they've been carried out not by politicians, not by governments, not by legislators, but by people like you and I. We tend to forget the power we hold when we take action. 100 years ago, in the struggle for an independent India, the ordinary citizens rose up and declared they will not wear Videshi clothes. That simple act led to almost toppling the British Empire. More recently, in facing a global pandemic, we saw tragedies we never thought possible striking closer to home. But we also learned that in the face of great adversity, we are capable of making changes to our own behaviors. That's what we need to do today. When I decide to reduce my own greenhouse gas emissions, even by 10% every year, that creates incentives for the industry to come up with climate-friendly solutions. When I decide that climate action is important to me, that creates pressure on my government to take strong commitments. When I decide to do something as simple as reuse, recycle, carpool, or use public transport to my office, or limit my use of appliances, or change my eating or shopping habits, or install a solar PV in my home. When I decide today to integrate such simple climate actions in my day-to-day life, that inspires 10 other people around me. It creates a ripple effect for even the larger systemic changes. But it all begins from me. It begins from my actions. We have a long and difficult journey ahead to reaching net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And we can only reach there with the consistent, collective, and contagious efforts of the common man. They say it will take nothing less than a miracle to avoid the worst effects of climate change. But when people like you and I come together to take action, miracles can happen. So I say this again. I may not care enough about climate change, but I'm still willing to do everything in my power to avoid its worst effects on my loved ones. And I hope you are too.